Deborah Miller did not even wait for the champagne to stop bubbling before she ruined the night. She stood there in the center of the Obsidian Peak salon, radiating a kind of expensive manufactured malice that made the air feel heavy. I was just reaching out to adjust a stray orchid in my sister Haley's hair when Deborah's hand shot out like a viper. She didn't just grab my arm, she snatched the vintage gold pin from my hair, the one my mother gave me before she passed. Before I could even blink, she tossed it into a half-full glass of champagne on a passing waiter's tray. She looked at me with a smirk that didn't reach her eyes and told me that a pathetic, penniless girl like me didn't deserve to wear family heirlooms in the presence of the Millers. She said I was a stain on the lineage they were trying to build with my sister, and if I wanted to stay for the engagement, I had to sign a legal waiver renouncing any future claim to the Miller estate or my own family's meager assets. She called me a nobody, a freelancer with a bank account as empty as my social standing, and warned me that her son Justin deserved a bride whose family wasn't dragging behind them like dead weight. Have you ever felt like the invisible one in your own family? Like no matter how much you build, people only see the version of you they've already decided is true? Let me know your story down in the comments. I'd love to hear how you handled it. Did I watch that gold pin sink through the golden bubbles of the champagne, resting at the bottom of the glass like a discarded piece of trash? My mother's pin. It was the only thing I had left that wasn't a line of code or a zero on a balance sheet. Deborah's laugh was sharp, a jagged sound that cut through the soft jazz playing in the Obsidian Peaks ballroom. She looked at me, then at the legal waiver in her hand, her eyes gleaming with the triumph of a woman who thought she'd finally put a stray dog in its place. I didn't scream. I didn't reach into that glass to fish out my dignity. Instead, I felt a familiar, cold sensation wash over me. It's the same feeling I get right before a massive market acquisition. A clinical, razor-sharp clarity that turns emotion into data. My anger wasn't loud. It was a balance sheet, and Deborah Miller had just gone into a deficit she could never repay. I looked her right in the eye, my face a mask of perfect, terrifying calm. I understand, Deborah, I said. My voice was steady, lower than the music, carrying a weight she wasn't smart enough to feel yet. You want to make sure the Miller name is protected from outsiders. She smirked, leaning in close enough for me to smell her expensive perfume. Exactly, dear. We have a reputation at the Peak. This isn't a place for little freelance girls from the suburbs. Now, sign the paper and go find a service entrance. Maybe the kitchen staff needs help with the dishes. I took the pen from her hand. It was a heavy, gold-plated thing, flashy like everything else about them. I signed the waiver without reading it. To her, it was a victory. To me, it was the final authorization I needed to stop treating this like a family matter and start treating it like a hostile takeover. You see, Deborah didn't know that 8 years ago when I was sitting in a dark basement powered by nothing but caffeine and spite, I wasn't just building a software firm. I was building Vance Capital. And Vance Capital doesn't just manage money. We own the infrastructure that makes the high society world function. We are the unseen pipes. The Obsidian Peak, this 6-star monument to old money excess, wasn't just a venue I chose for my sister. It was a recent addition to my portfolio. I looked around the room, seeing the tailored suits and the inherited titles, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of the old Maya, the girl who thought she had to shout to be heard. But then I remembered the wisdom of silence. Kicking and screaming is for the weak. The truly powerful don't need to raise their voice. They just need to change the locks. I stood there, dressed in my simple slate gray silk suit. No logos, no diamonds, looking every bit like the understated assistant they assumed I was. I had purposely dimmed my light so Haley could shine. She was a brilliant artist, a soul too pure for this den of vipers, and she was terrified of Deborah. I had promised myself I wouldn't outshine her on her big night. But as I watched Deborah walk away, already bragging to a group of socialites about how she'd handled the sister, I realized that protecting Haley didn't mean staying quiet anymore. It meant burning the house down so she wouldn't have to live in it. I walked toward the hallway, my black velvet flats silent on the hand-woven carpets. I wasn't retreating. I was moving to the war room. As I passed a floor-to-ceiling mirror, I caught my reflection. I didn't look like a victim. I looked like a shark that had just found a breach in the cage that I slipped into the manager's office on the mezzanine level. A room that smelled of cedar and expensive security. The Obsidian Peak's general manager, a man named Marcus who usually commanded the entire floor with a snap of his fingers, nearly tripped over his own feet when he saw me. He started to stammer out an apology, his face pale, but I raised a single hand. Silence. I didn't need his excuses. I needed execution. I pulled out my phone and used the secure satellite line, the one reserved for Vance Capital's high-priority operational shifts. My voice was a flat, clinical monotone as I spoke to my chief operations officer. Initiate Project Nightingale. Tier 1. Effective immediately. On the other end of the line there was a brief, sharp intake of breath. Tier 1 meant total isolation. It meant the digital equivalent of a heart attack for the target. The Miller family? Myso asked just to be sure. Every single one of them, I replied. Lock their internal corporate accounts. Freeze all discretionary spending tied to the Vance Hospitality Network. And Marcus, I looked at the manager who was standing at attention like a soldier. If a single Miller tries to put a drink, a meal, or a room on a house tap tonight, the system should flag it as a fraudulent transaction. Am I clear? Crystal, Miss Vance, he whispered. I walked back to the balcony overlooking the ballroom, watching the scene below through the glass. It was a masterpiece of toxic family dynamics. Deborah was currently cornering my sister Haley near the ice sculpture, her hand gripping Haley's arm a little too tightly. I could see Haley's shoulders tensing, her head bowing. Deborah was likely telling her that she was lucky the Millers were elevating her from her simple life. Then the first tremor hit. Justin, the groom-to-be, was at the bar with a group of his fraternity brothers, laughing loudly while ordering a round of $200 bottle scotch. He handed over his black corporate card with a flourish. The bartender swiped it. Then swiped it again. A frown creased Justin's forehead. He said something sharp, likely blaming the machine. I watched as the bartender shook his head and handed the card back. Justin pulled out another one. Denied. Then a third. Every single vein of credit he thought he possessed was being cauterized in real time. From my vantage point he looked like a small, confused child playing with a broken toy. Next to the floral arrangement, Brianna, the sister, checked her phone. Her face went from smug satisfaction to a mask of pure horror in 3 seconds. I knew exactly what she was seeing. An automated notification from the executive board of her firm, a firm Vance Capital had quietly acquired last quarter, notifying her of an immediate administrative suspension pending an ethics review. The Project Nightingale protocol was moving faster than a virus. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the oxygen. I was sucking the air out of their world, one digital door at a time. They had spent the whole night bragging about their status at the peak, unaware that the mountain they were standing on had just turned into a volcano. I felt a strange sense of peace. Most people think revenge is a hot, screaming thing. But for me it's just accounting. It's making sure the columns match. Deborah Miller thought she could buy my sister's silence and my absence with a gold-plated pen and a glass of champagne. She was about to find out that the debt she owed was far more than she could ever settle. That I stood back in the shadows of the mezzanine, watching the digital dominoes fall. My lawyer, Eleanor, arrived a few moments later, blending perfectly into the crowd in her sharp charcoal suit. She handed me a leather-bound folder with the Vance Capital seal, her eyes flickering with the kind of grim satisfaction only a top-tier litigator can possess. "The report you wanted," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the clinking of crystal below. "It is far worse than we suspected, Maya. The Miller family isn't just broke. They are a house of cards held together by spit and audacity." I opened the folder and the numbers began to tell their story. Justin Miller had been playing a dangerous game. To keep up the facade of a high-flying investor, he had leveraged every family asset. The house in Lake Forest, his father's retirement accounts, even the jewelry Deborah wore, to secure a series of high-interest loans. When those ran dry, he moved into the shadows. He had borrowed $4,500,000,000 from a private equity firm called Silver Shield. He'd signed over everything as collateral, betting on a massive IPO that had just crashed and burned. What Justin didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Silver Shield was a shell company I had acquired 18 months ago. The invisible chains of debt weren't just a metaphor. They were legal documents with my signature on the final page. I realized in that moment that Justin wasn't just a spoiled man-child. He was a con artist who was using my sister Haley as his next big score. He needed her connection to me even if he pretended to hate me, to provide a veneer of stability to his creditors. I looked down at Deborah, who was currently laughing with a senator's wife, gesturing with a hand adorned in a 3-carat diamond ring. That ring didn't belong to her. It belonged to me. The champagne she was drinking, the floor she was standing on, the very air she was breathing. It was all on my tab and the bill was long overdue. "The demand notice?" I asked Eleanor. "Delivered to his personal device 3 minutes ago," she replied. "We've also initiated the clawback provisions on the hotel credits. They are officially in default as of this second." I felt a cold, clinical thrill. In business, we call this a liquidation event. In my life I called it the truth. For years, I had allowed them to treat me like this spare, the unsuccessful sister who lived in a small apartment and did little websites. I had let them overdraft on my compassion until the account was empty. I watched Justin pull out his phone again. This time his face didn't just show confusion. It showed pure, unadulterated terror. He looked up, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. He whispered something to Brianna, whose face had gone a ghostly shade of white. They weren't just losing their jobs or their credit limit. They were losing their entire reality. Every lie they had told themselves about their superiority was being shredded by a series of encrypted emails and legal filings. "Should we wait for the cake cutting?" Eleanor asked with a ghost of a smile. "No," I said, adjusting my mother's gold pin, which Marcus had returned to me, now cleaned and gleaming. "I think it's time I stepped out of the shadows. I want to see the look on Deborah's face when she realizes she's been Sin Luke, the woman who owns her life." I started down the grand staircase, my movements measured and precise. I didn't need to hurry. When you own the building, the exit doors only open when you say so. That I moved down the staircase with a predatory stillness, my slate gray suit cutting through the sea of glitter and gold like a shadow. Eleanor walked a half step behind me, the leather-bound folder tucked under her arm like a weapon. We reached the center of the ballroom just as Deborah was loud-talking a group of potential donors, her voice thick with the arrogance of a woman who thought she owned the sky. She saw me coming and didn't even try to hide her disgust. She turned to her circle, pointing a manicured finger at me. "Oh, look, everyone. The little sister has come back. Did you finish the dishes, Maya? Or did you come to ask for a loan?" The circle of socialites tittered. Justin and Brianna hurried over, their faces tight with a panic they couldn't quite mask. Justin grabbed my shoulder, his grip desperate. "Maya, stop. Not now. We're having some technical issues with the accounts. Just go home. I'll call you tomorrow." I looked at his hand on my shoulder until he pulled it away as if he'd touched a hot stove. I didn't look at him. I looked at Deborah. "The dishes are done, Deborah. And the trash has been collected. Now I think it's time we discuss the bill." "The bill?" Deborah scoffed, tossing her head back. "I'm a miller. I don't discuss bills with freelancers. I discuss them with management." "Exactly," I said, my voice dropping into that lethal professional register. "And I am management." I nodded to Eleanor. She stepped forward and opened the folio. "Justin Miller." Eleanor's voice rang out, clear and cold, silencing the immediate area. "At 5:42 p.m. today, Silver Shield Holdings initiated a formal foreclosure on all collateral assets tied to your $4,500,000,000 loan. Since the primary residence, the Miller family accounts, and your mother's jewelry were listed as guarantees, they have been seized effective immediately." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Deborah's glass of champagne, the one I had paid for, shook in her hand. "Silver Shield? What are you talking about?" "Justin, tell this woman she's insane." Justin couldn't speak. He looked like a man watching his own execution. "But that's not all," I continued, stepping into Deborah's personal space. "Since you were so concerned about outsiders and reputations, I decided to do a deep dive into the Miller corporate filings. It turns out, Brianna, your PR firm hasn't just been consulting for Omnicorp. You've been funneling $600,000 a month into a private account. That's not PR. That's embezzlement. And since Vance Capital bought your firm last Tuesday, you've been stealing from me." Brianna let out a choked, high-pitched sob. The guests were leaning in now, phones starting to appear. The ruling class of the Grand Regency was watching their idols burn in real time. "You're lying," Deborah hissed, her face contorting into something ugly and primal. "You're a nobody. You're just Haley's sister." "No, Deborah," I whispered loud enough for the whole room to hear. "I'm the woman who owns the Obsidian Peak. I'm the woman who bought your son's debt. And I'm the woman who just revoked your access to the Met Opera, your country club, and your dignity." I turned to Marcus, who was standing nearby with 2 security guards. "Marcus, please escort the Millers to the service entrance. Since they can no longer afford the ballroom, I'm sure they'll find the alleyway more suited to their current net worth." Deborah lunged at me, her face a mask of fury, but the guards stepped in. She started to scream, a shrill, desperate sound of a woman who had realized her power was an illusion. Justin was slumped over a table, his head in his hands, while Brianna was being led away in tears. Haley stepped out from the crowd then. She walked over to Justin, who looked up at her with pleading eyes. Haley, baby, tell her. Tell her to stop this. We're getting married. Haley looked at him, then at the 3-carat ring on her finger. The ring bought with stolen money. She slowly, deliberately pulled it off and dropped it into the same glass of champagne where Deborah had thrown my mother's pin. My sister is my family, Justin, Haley said, her voice stronger than I'd ever heard it. And you? You're just a line item she's decided to delete. We walked away then, the sound of Deborah's fading screams echoing against the crystal chandeliers. The heavy oak doors of the Obsidian Peak ballroom swung shut behind us, cutting off the frantic, high-pitched shrieks of Deborah Miller. The sudden silence of the hallway was thick and cool, smelling of fresh lilies and the quiet scent of power. We didn't look back. There was no need. You don't look back at a controlled demolition once the charges have been blown. Outside, the Chicago air was biting, a fresh winter chill that felt like a baptism. I watched as Haley took a long, shuddering breath. Her eyes wet but her jaw set in a line of iron I had never seen before. She looked at her hand, the one where that stolen diamond had sat only minutes ago, and she started to laugh. It wasn't a laugh of joy. It was a cathartic, soul-clearing release of 3 years of suppressed breathing. That was the most expensive, most perfectly executed corporate execution I have ever witnessed, she said, leaning against the side of the waiting black SUV. She looked at me, a genuine smile finally breaking through. I think I owe you a lifetime supply of my paintings, Maya. And maybe a very large cheeseburger. I pulled her into a hug, a real one, the kind we used to share when we were kids and the world was just a place we were planning to conquer. You owe me nothing, Haley. You're my sister. And nobody, especially not an arrogant, entitled family who thinks a job title is a substitute for decency, gets to treat you like a footnote in their story. As the SUV pulled away from the curb, I looked out the window at the towering silhouette of the Obsidian Peak. Tomorrow the news would break. The Miller name would be a punchline in corporate circles from New York to London. There would be a temporary dip in the hotel's share price due to the sudden personnel shift, but it wouldn't matter. The rot had been excised. I looked down at my wrist, at the simple vintage gold chain that had survived the champagne glass. Some wealth doesn't need to shout to be heard. It doesn't need logos or 3-carat diamonds, or the approval of people who are bankrupt on the inside. True power is quiet. It's the ability to walk into a room, see exactly where the cracks are and decide when to let the light in. That night, for the first time in 8 years, I didn't check my phone for market updates. I didn't look at my spreadsheets. I just sat on the floor of our old apartment with my sister, eating greasy food and talking about the future. A future where we weren't defined by what we could provide, but by who we chose to be. Justice had been served, the debts were settled, and for once the balance sheet of my life was perfectly, beautifully in the black.